observant of you will realise we haven't got Maria McCann with us today. Unfortunately, she's unwell. So, Maria, I hope you're feeling better soon. Also, I'd like to say a shout out to Jonathan. Jonathan, you're not feeling well, and hopefully you're going to join us one of these Fridays. We'll look forward to that. But to replace Maria, we have Tony. So, welcome, Tony. Regular listeners will have heard Tony before, and we'll be talking about education, and we're talking about Generation Alpha. But today we'd like to start with COP28 and what that means for the world, what it means for individuals, and how we think it's going. So, Stuart, you've got some thoughts on this COP28?
Yeah, I have, and I guess disappointment and underwhelmed, I guess, would be my view. And it's not that I don't recognise how difficult some of this stuff is, and yes, we have made progress, but when you sit back and look at the headline, the headline is COP's been now going for 30 years, and we have finally agreed, in principle, and only really in principle, to transition away from fossil fuels. No commitment to how much and by when, not even a phase out, just a transition away from, and it's taken 30 years. Now, I know that some countries are impacted more than others based off of that type of decision, so I don't underestimate the difficulty in the decision. But the evidence of the planet burning down, and glacial decision making through COP28, the COP process, I just don't understand how that's ever going to cut it. If it's taken 30 years to get to an agreement to just transition away from, is it going to be another 30 years before we can actually put some targets around it? And then it'll be another 100 years before we actually do it. The planet won't exist by this stage, right? I mean, and the impact even on those difficult countries is going to be much more far-reaching with climate change than the inaction of slowing the whole decision and action process down, right? I mean, I just don't get it, guys. I'm sorry.
I view it, Stuart. It's the most difficult negotiation the world has ever had to try and get to a resolution to. I don't think history has ever. It's never faced this situation. I mean, tragically, as we can see, usually issues of this scale are settled by a war, to be quite honest. People end up fighting. We can see that tragically a couple of places in the world at the moment. We're just not used to trying to negotiate on this sort of scale. And there's so many different agendas coming in. I mean, I was just looking at it yesterday, and that agreement for fossil fuels, we've now got 2 or 3 of the island communities saying they weren't in the room to vote on it. So you've got representatives of, I don't know, 80-90% of the world all agreeing on it, but 2% of the world wasn't there. And that's democracy for you as well. So it's very, very difficult. The language is I suppose what you're saying is you've got the big picture. You're quite right to say why wasn't the first thing on the agenda getting rid of fossil fuels? Right? Just agree it's a good thing. But then you get into really difficult language about it. People start negotiating over different words. We see this in politics. You and I, Stuart, and Tony, I expect as well. You've seen this happen in large businesses, where you start off with a grand agenda and a purpose. Then you end up, I don't know, 6 or 7 hours later, talking, debating the niceties of language. It's really difficult.
And I wonder, Tony, so I know you're going to jump in, but I mean, to me, there's a direct linkage to actually the Gen Alpha research, which I know you're going to come on to talk about. And again, perhaps we talk a little about Gen Alpha and then double back to just demonstrate that some of the, I guess, the generational issues we're seeing or difficulties / challenges, is actually playing out on the world stage on COP is my view. And actually, again, if this is well-founded, leadership difficulties, decision influencing difficulties, etc., then there must be some training, Tony, that you could deliver help them, surely.
Yeah, so
well, just for me, I mean, you're absolutely right, and I share your frustration at the glacial progress. But in many ways, unfortunately, it's difficult to see how it can be anything otherwise. I know it needs to be faster, but it does come down to language. You're absolutely right, and often it is about agreement over specific terms, and it just goes to highlight just how important language is. And I guess in the work that I do with setting outcomes, that is most of the work. Once you can actually get agreement on the outcomes, then you can decide what you need to do to achieve those outcomes and try and build some consensus. But it just goes to show, firstly, how important language is, and then how important consensus building and influencing is. You can have all the STEM skills and the science skills in the world to identify the problem, but if you can't build influence to agree a solution or a way forward, then you've only got half of the results. And all this stuff around the Gen Alpha research is interesting, because it's been looking at how do workplaces need to adapt for this sort of income of younger workers into the workforce. And this is not a new issue. Every new generation comes along with a new set of challenges, but I think there are key challenges around information, particularly in communication for younger workers, that are being driven by widespread exposure to social media. They are the first generation that's properly grown up in the generation of influencers and influencing with social media. And it is very much about language, consensus building, who to trust, what counts as knowledge, although they wouldn't describe it as that. But if there's a statistic around, I think like 25% of Gen Alpha believe what they see on social media was more true than what they read in a book, or something like that. But just the idea that issue exists highlights the problem, because if we can't agree collectively on what we should be doing and we can't get consensus on language, then it's difficult to see how we're going to move forward with some of these big issues.
I agree with you, and interesting, and I've read some of the Gen Alpha research. I think it's actually, as always, it's the combination of things. So communication and influence is definitely there. Difficulties in resolving conflicts is a trait. People feel as though they're not trained to lead, even though they want to lead, but then they're not given the opportunity to lead, and that's a psychical issue, right? Fear of better options, want both freedom and structure. So when you add these things up with the information, decision making, influencing, you can see why COP28 is a cop out, right? I mean, it's
it's easy to think these are new problems, but I think if you look at COP28 and you see difficulty in reaching any kind of consensus, then we can't just sort of put it on Gen Alpha as a problem that they have problems with conflict resolution. It's like, clearly the world has a problem with conflict resolution. It's not a new problem.
I think it does, and I think what's adding to that is a couple of things you've mentioned already. Is influence. Influence has changed completely. What some generations think of as influence really isn't. They're talking about influencers and everything that happens there. And the other thing is what's happened to the truth? What's happened to what do we understand? And you have to look at American politics. Sadly, some of our politics as well. When the truth doesn't really matter, it's more around what do people see? What do they have access to? Again, in our debate around diversity that we've been having with different groups, it's the same. Unfortunately, the loud and aggressive and spectacular arguments become the truth, and the normal run-of-the-mill conversations around that subject don't find the light of day. So that influence and what is the truth is really, really difficult. I was listening to some scientists and some activists talking about the ocean yesterday, and I think if I had to write down afterwards what I'd learned that was truthful, I couldn't do it, because there were arguments and counter arguments to every single point. So you end up, I know everything's getting warmer, okay, but on this specific level with those two people talking, I've got no idea now what's the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that adds to it as well. It's really difficult.
Yeah, it reminds me, there was a great bit of research I came across. It's not a new piece of research. It's by a guy called Dr. Robert Cialdini, and he wrote a book called The 7 C's of Influencing, and it's one of the Harvard best business books of all time, that kind of thing. But I think we are in that world, and I think if we think that we're not in the business of influencing, whether at a day-to-day level or whether at a global COP28 level, then we're in the wrong business. We're not seeing the issue. It's things like knowing how to move people. People, some of these principles are like, people require consistency. They do what they observe others doing. They trust authority. They prefer similarities, all these kind of things. It's like, if we go to the research, this is where research is really useful around behavior. If we want people to do things, it isn't about truth. You're right. We can see that from Trump and post-truth and whatever. Truth doesn't really matter anymore. It's about influence, and it's about persuasion and how you get people to do what you want them to do. So
it's interesting. I mean, the amount of times I've coached individuals who in a leadership capacity who states that they don't like the company politics. And interesting, if you were to look at the definition of politicking and politics, it is actually influence. That is what politics is, right? I guess what people hate, and for good reason, is when people politic for their own personal agenda, personal gains, rather than being an objective thing for the business or the organization or for the planet in light of COP28, right? People have parochial views of the world, and therefore the way they politic and what they politic for is not necessarily wholly objective, right? But actually, politics is influence. This is all about influence. I think you're right.
Yeah, businesses work on a more human level than companies would like to admit. We all know that. We've seen, all of us have seen really great influencers. We've seen some people that ride roughshod over that, and how that can be effective sometimes, let's be honest. And other times it can be very ineffective, and it can also come back to bite you very badly rather. I don't know how, Tony, what your thoughts on this. The other part of the report here was about teaching younger generations to use digital in a I don't know what quote professional way. What does that mean in your view? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that you go to design, because even before we get into digital, I think you could say that. Well, I'm a great believer in the fact that what you get is a result of what you design. The issues that we get in politics, the issues that we get with climate change, are issues that we've created through, whether it's conscious or unconscious design. And when people like Trump get elected, it's because it's a result of the systems that we've designed. So as a designer and as sort of a systems thinker, I mean, while these things are terrible, they are often the result of things that we've created. So for me, a lot of this is a design problem, and design can offer potential solutions. And you could say that, the climate change COP28, where we're at now, it's not a failure of education, but it's the product of 150 years of industrial era education. And actually now there is a need to rethink education broadly. And I'm always trying to pull back and go, well, what broadly should we be aiming at? And I think some of this research into Gen Z, Gen Alpha is really interesting. It does show that what's being taught in schools probably does need to shift. And I think that's probably a no-brainer, but it's like, where are we emphasizing the right things? If we know that communication and influencing plays a bigger part in modern life, workplace life, politics, whatever it is, then we should be teaching that. That should be as core as STEM. It's like, why are we teaching kids how to code if AI is going to code? Why aren't we teaching them about the softer skills and influencing and persuasion? And this is the real stuff. It's like sometimes they just learn all this after school. And well, what's school about then? It's almost like there's this increasing disconnect between the world that we've created and what we're trying to educate people into. And I'm not saying that it's the fault of education, but it does feel like there is a need to reprioritize some of these things in education, to say, well, what kind of world do we want? And this is where it comes back to learning design for me. It's like, what are your outcomes? What are you going to do to get people there? And if this bit of education over here is sending people over there, then it's not bringing them over here. And this is where we need them. We need them to be thinking about influencing in climate and politics. And, so I do think there is a bit of a systemic issue in terms of this disconnect between education and work or adult life, if you like, that actually warrants it. And this is where you're seeing the growth of things like boot camps and these sort of these courses that try and fill the gap between education, higher education, and the workplace, because unfortunately, I think these things, while they're doing great work in terms of, educating the whole person, they're not actually preparing people for the real challenges and giving them the real skills that perhaps they're going to need to be effective more quickly. It's no good being effective when you're 50. It's like we need people to come into the workforce at 2025 and know what needs to happen to make a difference,
Yeah, Tony, we talked about this on and off for a couple of years, haven't we? And everyone's seen it. We all did algebra at school or something like that and never used it, right? Nothing's changed. But in the discussion we had on the future of work, one of the things we all agreed is that change is happening quicker than it's ever happened before, right? And it's now really necessary. With AI coming on, and I know you've done a lot of work on AI in education, and Stuart, you've done a whole load of work with AI in Atom Bank. It's pace, right? It's pace. It's coming now. It's not, we hadn't heard of AI 6 months ago, not really, not in the work environment. Now it's there every day, and everyone's trying to figure out what they do with ChatGPT and 100 other that keep getting thrown at me via LinkedIn. And so that change has got to happen. It's got to happen really, really quickly. Otherwise, people are just going to get left behind.
Yeah, and I was reading some stuff around, there's a lot of, it's the time of year where you get a lot of reports around future work trends for 2024, and there's some great reports coming out on LinkedIn at the moment. But it was looking at AI and L&D, and it was saying sort of, don't worry, you're not falling behind, but broadly everyone is basically using AI to do what they were already doing, but faster, rather than using it. It's the classic Henry Ford problem, isn't it? It's like if I wanted people to ask them what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So I think it's, we're in that sort of like technological shift, and I mean that could take 1 or 2 generations to fully work differently, but it doesn't negate the urgency of asking some of these questions around what should we actually be teaching people, both at school but also in the workplace. Like what do we really need people to be learning to make a difference? And yet a part of that is technology and how to communicate effectively, but a massive part of that is influencing. Like you were saying, Stuart, if you're not thinking about influencing and you're not thinking about company politics, then you shouldn't be there, because that's the game you're in. You're in a big organisation. It's all politics.
Again, I'm going to just cite an example, then double back to COP on this influencing. And that was, we just recently held an exploration session through FRB on operational resilience, and it was amazing that how many companies cited that obviously when they were in crisis, suddenly change happened, right? And I wouldn't break any confidence in the companies, but there was one company that tried 3 years to share information internally in their broad business and weren't allowed for various protocols, and the minute COVID hit, they got the agreement overnight that they could, right? And it instantaneously transformed the way they worked, right? Now you sort of think, and it took a crisis to do that. Now, as it often does, right? When a business is in survival mode, suddenly changes happen. And I guess the reason why I'm raising that is because you don't need to influence, or the position of power of influence is so much greater, so much, in your moment to do things. It's much easier to make things happen. So I guess I'm still struggling then on COP28, because the evidence is overwhelming, right? Absolutely overwhelming. There is no time like the present, and yet we're still making decisions at a glacial pace. It just seems as though, there is still very little influential, power yet, even with all this massive, overwhelming evidence, right? And I guess that's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, I think it's easy to sort of poke a stick at it, isn't it? But I think it's, as Carl, as you said, it's the most complex challenge humanity has ever faced. And I guess we can't lose sight of that, because I think it almost is too big a problem for people to apprehend. It's so urgent, but it's too mind-blowing. I remember like when I went to India about 10 years ago and had this sort of perception of life as like this. And then when I came back, my universe felt like this. Yeah. And I think COP's a bit like that. We're all sort of stuck here. And actually the problem is this big, but we haven't almost got the critical faculties to fully apprehend it to a point where we can actually do something collectively. I think that, and it is that collective action that I think is, I mean, you could argue that it's the next big thing that humanity needs to learn. We're all still working on a very much an individual capitalist mentality about how we like personal gain. And if I do this, then I can do that for you. And that's a big question. But it's actually, how do you get to a more altruistic way of working with people and say, this is for the good of everyone? I mean, that's a massive mindset shift.
So I think you've just said something. You've said a couple of things there, Tony, that are outrageous. One is that it's for the good of everybody. I mean, how dare you think of something like that? What an outrageous thought to have. And the other thing is, you said earlier, what's the output we're looking for? If you were to ask everybody at that conference what the output is we're looking for, you wouldn't get an answer.
No.
And that probably goes into, Stuart, what you said, you know, phasing out fossil fuel should have been number one on the agenda. Right? Just to agree it's a good thing, right? Not agree how to do it. Yeah, we get how to do it is going to be very, very difficult, very expensive, right? But 30 years on, guys and girls, just to get to the fact that this looks like something we ought to do. I mean,
Now it just shows if you can't get agreement over outcomes, almost the rest of it is pointless, because unless there is genuine consensus around outcomes, then everything else is a talking shop until you can genuinely get agreement. But even that is difficult because things change, people change, because these things take time. Then people leave and whatever, and then that next person doesn't agree. So I mean, this is why it's such a complex problem to solve.
But you know, it is amazing that we come back to this is exactly the same problems we have in large organisations. Right, it's the same, all the same dynamics here. Stuart, you've been there, HSBC and people. There's all. This is the same dynamic we have. How do we get consensus? How do we build a direction? And how do we keep to that direction? You know, the work we're doing on environment and the whole thing about the FRB is how do we be responsible businesses, right? So I guess if what needs to happen is COP28 needs to come to the FRB and say how do we do this, and we'll help them. But it is a very difficult. So we're being flippant, but it's a very difficult challenge. We get it.
But again, this is well researched. I mean, I know that Tony even mentioned a book earlier, which I've had the pleasure of reading too, and there's several out there on influence. And everyone talks about things like Johari windows, what's hidden and what's open and what's public and what's private, and things like getting to a win-win, right? Rather than a win-lose or a lose-win, depending on which side you sit on. And actually everyone talks about compromise actually generally normally being a lose-lose, right? That is what a compromise actually is. And lo and behold, I think that's where we got to on COP28 is a lose-lose. Actually, it's a lose-lose-lose. It's a lose for everyone in the room. It's a lose for everyone not in the room. And it's a lose for the planet, right? Yeah. It's like, and yet we know this stuff, right? This is well-documented, well-founded, well-researched stuff, and yet we're still following the same old protocols, right?
Well, I think it's interesting because I suppose that in terms of, for me, I'll always bring it back to education and learning, and is this a learning problem? And I do think it does raise some interesting questions around what we should be teaching, what we should be prioritizing, because particularly now, in the last 12 months of AI, it's obviously a huge topic, very easy to generalize, but if you can start to automate some formerly manual things and speed people up, then what do you get them to think about? And it does feel like these what have formerly been soft skills are actually the things that we really need to focus on. AI should free us up to be more human and to tackle the problems that we've created in the last 150 years of evolution. And that's, for me, that's a good thing. I know it's a very easy to generalize again, but
and it's also, I think it's a really good point. And and I guess on AI, where AI is today is it's great on information and knowledge consumption and usage, right? That's the IQ, the logical side of our brains. It's not so good yet on the EQ, the emotional side. And actually, people are doing some really good work in this, using like AI as the primary, and then they move to human service and human interaction when you get to edge cases and difficulties and the emotional piece. And obviously people are saying that's coming on AI, and I'm sure it is, by the way. And I've seen some actually really clever stuff coming through, but it's still, you can see why AI can do the logical stuff pretty easily. It's the emotional stuff, and therefore logically, to your point, Tony, shouldn't we be educating people much more in the EQ skills and the SQ skills, for that matter, just spiritual intelligence, rather than just the IQ stuff that can be tested and validated in an exam paper?
And I think, unfortunately, for so long, we've had so many people stuck in that logical stuff. I remember sitting outside an office block in London a few years ago and thinking most of the people in that office block are moving pieces of paper around. They're right. It's not paper now. Okay, it's emails. They're not really contributing everything. They're doing something at the moment. They're doing all that logical stuff and they're making the logical thing move. that's just going to vanish. I agree with you completely, Stuart. That's where AI is going to come in. It's going to change. And in education, it all used to be about research. It's do research. It's learn about Hitler, learn about Germany, learn about. Well, now you've got all that information at your fingertips, right? Yeah. The question is, why did Germany end up going that direction? Why has Israel gone in this direction? What's all that stuff? And that's all the people bit, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's one of the skills in that future of work report was around critical thinking, and it's such an overused term. It's like, oh, we need to learn more about critical thinking, but if you really get into it, we are facing a problem it's a thinking problem, and we are constrained by our own thinking. That L&D report was an example. It's like we're using the new technology to do what we have always done faster. What we're really struggling to do is get meta and get above the problem and go, okay, if we can do that, if that frees us up with some time, what should we be spending that time on? And that mental intelligence, that the stuff that humans are really good at, that technology can't do. And it's not an easy thing to do, but as that bit gets automated, what should we be focusing on then? And it is things like COP28. I mean, COP28 is a great example of this is a massively complicated problem that cannot be solved by technology. It's a human problem. We've created it. We need to spend time influencing, talking about it, and trying to move it forward. And that, automate all this stuff over here. Great. Give us the more headspace and more time to do that bit. And it's like that for me is what we're looking at. It's like automate, free us up more time to get more human and actually solve some of these really massively complex problems.
But it leads us to a place where you need a different type of people. We've been saying this for years, a different type of person running and in charge of stuff. For want of a better expression, whether it's a CEO of a company, MD of a company, our politicians, that needs a different type of person.
But it comes. I mean, you're in the. You are the Fellowship of Responsible Businesses, and I think it's a great title because this idea of what responsible looks like is never been more important. It's like, well, if I can automate that, I don't need people to do that. I need people to do the more responsible thing around looking at our sustainability, looking at our carbon impact, and actually doing stuff around it and influencing people to change their behavior. That's the really hard work. Getting people to change behavior, like I can automate the shit out of that spreadsheet over there, that's fine. But actually getting people to permanently change their behavior, that's hard. That is hard work. That's proper work. And that is where we need different people.
Are we getting carried away here? Is automating that spreadsheet actually, okay, whether morally it's the right thing to do, that's another question for another day. Perhaps moral, we'll do morals next week, okay? But I'm just thinking, in fine art, my father was an artist. In fine art, he would say that it's the making of it, it's the doing of it that takes him in a different direction. And he was a very successful artist, and he broke a mold a couple of occasions and went over here. And everyone said, "What are you doing that for?" And then you say, "Wow, that's fantastic." And are we going to get to a place where the doing of it is not being done by people, so we lose that instinctive? Where do we go next?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I agree. I mean, I think, and again, Tony, I'm not going to speak for you, but I think what Tony was saying a minute ago was the fact that we're going to be doing different things. It's not that we're not going to be doing anything, right? It's just what we do today and what we see as work and stuff today may be different tomorrow. But it's not we don't do anything. We're just going to be doing different things, right, than we do today.
I think your point, and I'll just say, Carl, you mentioned break the mold. I think that's a nice way of sort of that's what I was talking about. Really, is like how do you break the mold? The difficulty we have is actually breaking the mold. Our thinking is in a mold and we're stuck in it. And there's a great quote. I think it's John Dewey said the hardest thing to break is a mental rut already made. It's like we're in a rut and we can't think outside of it. And actually, what we need is some creativity and some fine art thinking to go blow it open. That's what's really needed.
That's a really good point, Tony. I was in a conversation just yesterday evening with a young guy, and he's got a great future. It's going to happen, right? Someone in his office keeps saying to him, "You're not being professional," right? Because he likes to throw a tennis ball up and down, and keep himself occupied, and do all this sort of stuff. And he's a youngster and he's full of energy. And and I'm thinking, so what's this professional, right? Is the mold professional? And Stuart, you did some great work on this. First direct, you had hopscotch marked out on the floor, didn't you? To sort of break, what is this professional? And I'd say to him, go back and ask, what do you bloody think professional is, right? What's that? So perhaps that's the mold we need to break, is the professional.
I think that's it. And I think if you could just to bring it back to COP28, you could say that everyone's playing an imagined role. They all think that they have a role, and they're stuck in that role. You're a political negotiator. You've got a certain role, and actually, what we need is to try and get out of that and get some proper fresh thinking that's going to get above it. That's the real challenge.
Yeah,
totally agree.
Well, there we go, guys. That's been a great half an hour. I think you've cured the world. I think I've got a phone call coming in. I think COP28 are now on the phone. I think they've recognised our skills and talents.
Can we in?
Yeah, we just need to negotiate a day rate, I think, or something like that. I'll keep putting the zeros on until we get to a good point. So that's great. Thank you, everybody. Our time is up. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Stuart. And get well quickly, Maria. And we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks,
Thank
Stuart.
you. Cheers.